The psychedelic revolution is here. If you want to integrate your visionary experiences into your purpose, get clear on your entrepreneurial path, and help people while you do what you love, then this podcast is for you. Welcome to The Psychedelic Entrepreneur, Medicine for These Times. I'm your host, Beth Weinstein. I'm a spiritual business coach, 3-time entrepreneur, and a lifelong student of psychedelics and sacred plant medicines. You carry your own unique medicine, and your medicine is what we need for these times. This podcast will help you to share your medicine so you can create transformation in the world. Listen in on conversations with psychedelic leaders, changemakers, and conscious entrepreneurs who are living proof that a better world is possible when you follow your heart and live in alignment with your soul. Hey everyone, welcome back to The Psychedelic Entrepreneur. Today I have with me Joseph Mays. Hey Joseph, thank you for being here.
Hi Beth, thank you so much for having me.
Great. So just a little bit of background. Joseph Mays received his master's in ethnobotany from the University of Kent upon researching responses to globalization by indigenous Yanesha of central Peru. After graduating with biology and anthropology degrees from Virginia Commonwealth University, he conducted an ethnobotanical survey in the Ecuadorian cloud forest and published a medicinal plant guide for the Jama-Coaque Ecological Reserve. His conservation work emphasizes how cultural conditioning influences approaches to biocultural sustainability. Joseph is program director of Chacruna's Indigenous Reciprocity initiative of the Americas, where he conducts research and builds connections with small indigenous communities throughout the Americas to support Chacruna's mission of increasing cultural reciprocity in the psychedelic space. Joseph, I wanted to bring you on and talk about this important work that's going on at Chacruna. And there's a lot happening. It's just so exciting and interesting and kind of scary at the same time to see how fast everything's evolving in this space. But let's hear your story first. What brought you onto the path of, what you've studied and working for Chacruna? And I'm curious how your own work with the plant medicines played into your career path.
Sure.
If at all.
Yeah, they definitely did. Thanks for getting through that bio. I think it's almost a vocal warm-up on its own. A lot of tongue twisters. I think it really comes from a love of nature. I think primarily just I was raised in a military family. My dad was in the Navy, so I moved like every 3 years. And so sometimes I was homeschooled by my mom in like second grade. And there was a lot of kind of natural history involved in those early educational experiences, just studying plants and animals, studying like raising tadpoles into frogs, and then studying like the different species of juniper outside on the street and looking and identifying them by their cones and berries and just when I lived in Scotland, my mom had a big garden. We lived on a farm because a kind family let us stay in like their farmhouse. So just having this love of the environment and of nature, I think, which comes naturally to kids, and just seeing the degradation of the environment and seeing all of the sad, tragic history of human involvement, of recent human involvement, because that's not always been the relationship between humanity and nature. I think it's more of a sort of past couple centuries that it's really gone the way that it has. But I came to that, and I think, I'm an artist. I wanted to go to art school, but then I studied biology because my dad wanted me to do something practical. As we all know, biologists make tons of money. So I studied biology, and then I had a professor for an anthropology class named Edward Absey, and he did his field work with the Mazatec in Oaxaca. And so He talked about, his initiation with psilocybin, and it opened me up to something I was already sort of interested in from reading a few books like Cosmic Serpent by Jeremy Narby, who's an anthropologist, reading some ethnographic stuff. But after I took that class, I decided to double major or do a dual degree in anthropology. And, Edward Apsey had a huge impact on me. He taught a class called South American Ethnography. And that's when I really got exposed to more in-depth work on different indigenous cultures, and their relationships with nature was always something that really struck me. And over the years, I've been working with plants. I was working my way through college at a plant nursery. I was working in horticulture for a long time, landscaping, doing edible landscapes and native landscaping. And when I went to graduate school for ethnobotany, I had been working in permaculture as well. So as you mentioned, I went to Ecuador. I was working I was doing a permaculture program part of the time I was there, and learning about tropical food production and growing food in a way that is harmonious with the environment, utilizing like ecological succession, and trying to create a self-sustaining system that doesn't need external inputs like fertilizers and herbicides and pesticides, because this is the way that indigenous agriculture works. And in graduate school, there was a school of anthropology and conservation, but really they were like two divided groups because they had very different perspectives on how to deal with conservation, because traditionally or conventionally, environmentalists and biological conservationists would use this model called fortress conservation, which is just taking people away from an area and then closing it off and trying to preserve nature that way. And that's like how the national park system works. That's how a lot of preserves and reserves work. But in the anthropology world and the ethnobotany world, you actually find that indigenous territories, indigenous land, community-owned forests, and locally managed forests have more biodiversity, more carbon storage, more species richness. All the different markers of ecological well-being are in greater abundance in those areas than they are in like national parks. And so pushing people off of the land is actually sort of counterproductive. It also just feeds into this idea that you can separate humans from nature. It's really not possible. There's no such thing as pristine, untouched wilderness. All of the forests that we see have been shaped by humans, and in even the Amazon rainforest, when Europeans arrived, they thought it's just wild jungle, but really it's all been shaped by huge human civilizations that were there, that practiced agroforestry, that used different guilds of species that work together to create higher yields. And that's how people survived, because there was no other option. And living in close relationship with the land, everything around you is part of this network that you have to be in tune with, or else you won't survive. So it's been made clear to me that this pursuit is really it's one and the same: trying to conserve nature and trying to conserve indigenous cultures, trying to protect indigenous communities. Has to be done in concert to conserve nature. So to conserve cultural diversity, you have to conserve biodiversity, and vice versa, and you can't really separate the two. And so that's really what I feel like is at the core of what I do, and it's all really can be summed up by a relationship. So ethnobotany is about the relationship between people and plants, and anthropology and ecology is all about relationships as well. So ecology is the relationship between different organisms in an environment. So I think that's the key.
Wow, it's beautiful, and this is such an important topic. I actually just interviewed Charles Eisenstein last week for this podcast, and there's just so many questions about the hopelessness in the world and the earth, and how are we going to get into this harmony and this balance in every which way, right? It's like environmental, people, relationships, all the systems, the reciprocity. Then we get into, the details of, let's say the plant medicine space or the psychedelic space. I mean, we can go on and on. It feels like everything is sometimes in disharmony, right? And everything feels broken. I tend to be an optimist and think that we're going in some sort of a right direction, even though things feel very hard at times. But, more and more people are having these discussions about this interconnection and this, this concept of not being separated at all, right? We are all interconnected, and this is a symbiotic relationship, and this is the only way for anybody to survive. And, we've talked about this a lot in my summits about how this relationship with plant medicines, whether psychoactive or not, really, or just all plants are medicine, how it really is waking up, hopefully, a lot of people to question the way we have been doing things. Like even what you said, like permaculture versus, large scale industrial agriculture. I mean, we can compare like the way it's been, the way it's hopefully going, which is essentially returning back to indigenous ways, right? On some level. So let's talk about the work that you're doing currently at Chacruna or anywhere in the plant medicine world. And, maybe we should call it earth medicines, right? Because it's much more than plants.
Sure.
There's a lot to talk about. But yeah, what has been going on for you in that realm?
Well, so much. And I think Charles is a great person to talk to about those things. I've been inspired by his work, definitely. It's like the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible. I think, when I want to feed that optimistic but very realistic, sort of drive, it's a good place to go. I think you really touched on it when you said interconnectivity, and also I'd love that you mentioned that psychoactive plants is not the only category that's important, and really if you're in the forest, all plants are psychoactive, and dietas don't just involve psychoactive plants that Western science has recognized as psychoactive, and food is medicine as well as plants and fungi and water, and I think that is the lesson that a lot of people get from psychedelic experiences is this interconnectivity. But because, up until that experience, maybe they've felt isolated and alienated from their environment, from themselves, from their family, from, all of their life, because that's kind of the way that our conditioning is meant to make us feel. And it facilitates the destruction of the environment. It facilitates exploitation. It facilitates extraction. All those things are easier to do if you're completely alienated from the from the resources that you're dependent on, from the food and the medicine that you're dependent on, from the people that you're dependent on. So I think when psychedelic experiences challenge that or break down that separation, people have this feeling and this sense of connection, really, really profound and deep connection, and they see the life and intelligence in plants and things that normally aren't considered thoughtful or intelligent. But this stuff has all been being supported by, empirical scientific studies looking at plant communication and all these amazing things that go on that we used to think were exceptional to humans. And that's kind of what this animistic point of view that a lot of indigenous cultures have also sort of says, is that everything is intelligent, everything has a consciousness that's communicating at all times. And so if you're in tune with that, that's going to inform all of your relationships and including the ones that your agricultural practices, all of your operations. And I think for a lot of people in the global north, there's really you have that experience, and then what do you do afterwards? It's well, now I realize that this alienation now I realize my connection and interdependence with all these things. How do I act on that, and like how does that affect my life now that I've been made aware of that? And of course, it's not gonna do anything if you don't practice afterwards. You have to do it daily. It's like recognizing that truth and experiencing it isn't something that just happens. And when you like decide that that's the way it is, it takes work, and it takes like constant work. And that's what reciprocity is as well. It's like reciprocity isn't about just give and take, you do something for me, I do something for you. It's about in the Andean cultures that came up with this word Aini, Quechua word that a lot of people translate as reciprocity. It doesn't really mean what a lot of people say that it means. It's about this like constant imbalance. So it's not really about harmony in this kind of way that we think about it. It's like there's constant disharmony and imbalance in every moment, and your role as a human being that recognizes your position in this like system is to always try to correct that imbalance. And it takes constant work, and it never finishes. And so it's like that's kind of part of the reciprocity initiative that we created at Chacruna. The Indigenous Reciprocity Initiative of the Americas. It's an online resource primarily that consists of 20 different indigenous organizations, and that they're spread out throughout North America, the United States, Mexico, Costa Rica, and then Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. And it's meant to facilitate investment into those communities, and it's meant to be a pathway for reciprocity. It's like, obviously the healing starts in your own life with yourself and with your immediate community, but a lot of people want to give back to indigenous communities. They want to give back to something greater that might contribute to conservation in some way that you can't do on your own. And there are a lot of great options out there, but I think there's something unique about the Indigenous Reciprocity Initiative, or ERIE is what we call it. It's faster to say. ERIE is special because it's a model based on these principles that we've been talking about. It's directed by the communities that it's supporting. There's no authority above that's imposing anything on them. So like all other funding models pretty much in the NGO nonprofit space are based around reporting and having certain deliverables, and there are people that have to be satisfied at the end of the day who are not the communities on the ground. In order for that funding to go forward, they have to meet certain requirements that are set by people outside of the communities. And so this results in, if you just look at the history of these interventions, they're not usually sustainable, and they usually are short-lived. They serve a certain purpose for people that are not there at all, or that have their own goals. And the indigenous communities are still experiencing the same or worse amount of poverty, of displacement, disempowerment. So we wanted to flip that and create something that was decolonized, and basically that means that the funds don't have any strings attached to them. There's no conditions on them. The network is built on trust, and these relationships have been built over multiple years. And each organization has their own structures of accountability that are based on how the community decides to structure it. So community assembly, they have, if they're doing like a reforestation project, for example, they will do the mapping themselves and decide where they want to focus on replanting. They'll also vote on the species of plants that they're going to focus on cultivating in their nursery. And it's all coordinated and controlled by those communities. And the funds are flexible, so they can use them for anything they need. Fuel costs like food, water, medicine, transportation, supplies. They don't have to like send us a application or a report or something, and tell us how each dollar is going to be used and guarantee, something. And it just, so far, it seems to be the ideal situation, and it's also creating a much stronger foundation for something that's sustainable. And I think that was the original goal, was just to have an answer for that question of like, how do I act on this lesson that I've learned about interconnectivity, and I want to do something about what I'm seeing, and I don't know what to do. I could donate to like a huge nonprofit or NGO, or you could donate to Erie, and I think it feels like a pretty special niche in the current psychedelic movement.
Beautiful. No, this is great. And I agree. It's like giving the money to the people actually on the ground doing the work versus organizations where it's going into a vortex and we don't really know how it's, where it's going and if it's actually making change. Now, I'm curious, is this the funds that you're funding different communities? Is this mostly for, I mean, how is it affecting, let's say, sacred medicine, whether it's, ayahuasca or peyote or, those are the two that come to mind the most that we've been hearing about, potential sustainability issues and overharvesting. Are they going to reforestation of those particular plants, or all the other plants that are being affected by the overharvesting or the harvesting in general? And then also, I want to ask a deeper question about how this affects all these other organizations and people out there who are, serving this medicine and expanding, and even companies going into these spaces. Is this a model that is potentially going to be rolled out into, let's say, the private sector so that we can actually give back and bring everything, hopefully, be in that reciprocity in this kind of, in the whole psychedelic world, as I would call it. But yeah, let's hear about the details. Like, is what sparked this and also a deeper question: is there really a sustainability issue with these plants? Because I've actually heard I've heard different stories. I've heard, and the one thing, I do my part. My one part is I work with a person who has a whole reforestation, replanting initiative within his own region, where it's like, I know where my medicine comes from. I know who's growing it. I know who's taking care of it. I know it's not being unsustainably harvested. Yeah. At least as far as I know. But yeah, let's talk about that, because there's a lot of people curious. Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's a few different, like you said, there are different perspectives on that. For just to answer your first question, each organization has their own goals, their own projects that they're doing on the ground. These grassroots community organizations. So some of them are focused on reforestation. Some of them are focused on like water security or land tenure. So, but they're all connected. So like the deforestation is a problem. Unfortunately, as many reforestation projects as there are, the deforestation keeps happening at an increasing rate. And there won't be plant medicines if that happens. It doesn't really matter if these reforestation efforts are focused on psychedelic plants or not. Mm-hmm. We need that biodiversity to sustain any sort of activity that we want to do. And so the goal of Erie is to be the most effective and impactful way to address biodiversity, sustaining biodiversity and conserving biological and cultural diversity. And that ultimately is what sustains the plant medicine industry. The healing art of using plant medicines is all sustained by that biodiversity. So in that sense, in an indirect way, it is. But for each group, there are some indigenous communities that don't really use psychedelic plants that are involved, but they're all contributing to that main goal. There are three groups in southern United States and Mexico that we support in Erie, partners with the Wixárika Research Center, as well as Hablemos de Jicuri, and Jicuri is the Wixárika word for peyote. So these are both Wixárika directed, or Huichol, they're also called. They're both working primarily on issues around peyote, creating like community plant nurseries that are managed by indigenous people that are trying to replenish those, but also just having like conversations with the different indigenous groups that use peyote and coming up with collective strategies and agreements on how to address the problem. There's also a Mazatec a community association that we're funding. They haven't gotten their like organizational infrastructure together yet, so they don't have a website. But we'll be adding that to the Erie website as soon as it's ready. But they're working on issues in the Mazatec community, and some of those are directly related to psilocybin mushrooms. But I think one of the important parts of the Erie sort of message is that it's not about just targeting one plant and thinking that's the best approach. Sometimes that is, but I think it's important to see that if you can't support like the basic needs of these communities who are living in greater poverty than any other demographic in the world, meanwhile this extremely lucrative business is growing, very wealthy people are visiting these same communities which don't have food and water, which are displaced, and their land availability shrinks and shrinks. Unfortunately, it's just like, it doesn't matter how well-intentioned people are, the incentives of the system that they're working within will just lead to greater exploitation at every chance that it has. And it's really hard to do anything about that without a systemic change. But I think teaching people about this model and these relationships will help better inform us. And I think it's unfortunately it's pretty much restricted to the private sector at the moment. I would love to see governments commit funds to Erie or something. But at the moment it's aimed at business leaders and investors in the psychedelic space, as well as individuals and just like everyone that can give whatever they can. All levels of support are welcome. This was aimed at people that have felt the benefits of psychedelic plants in their lives and wanted a way to give back. But it's also trying to create new ways of engaging with reciprocity. So like a business could commit a certain percentage of profits to go to this, or somebody can commit a certain amount of their salary. People do matching donations for their employees. There's like all kinds of different ways that it could be integrated into a business model. And I think there are other great projects, Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund. There are a few other wonderful initiatives that are similar to Erie, and I'm sure that there will be more coming. I think Erie has something special and unique about it, but of course I would love to see more and more reciprocity initiatives pop up.
This has come up a lot, especially as this whole psychedelic, industry, I hate that word, but I can't, there's not a better word, but as it grows, as there's venture capital going into it, whether these are, lab created psychedelics versus sacred plant medicines, it's all still interconnected, right? And it's come up so much around how are all these, millions of dollars and venture capital and, funds and, new businesses popping up every day. How are they giving back? And how are we going to get this right? Because, to me, it's like if you're on one path, you're going to start opening up to the other path. And, we've all seen the growth of, let's say, ayahuasca or psilocybin or, even peyote used in other ways than traditional, which I'm always a little surprised by, but it's happening, right? Yeah. And it's like, how do we start having these really important discussions around what is the truth of what's happening, and what will happen? I recently was in Costa Rica with someone who's actually does very similar work as you, and she pointed out something very basic to me that I was like, oh, I never really gave that thought. Is when you're going and harvesting whatever it is, doesn't matter if it's ayahuasca or chacruna or another plant, doesn't matter. The whole the whole forest is affected. It's like ayahuasca doesn't just grow in a straight line by itself in a large field, right? It's
Right.
it's wrapped around, hundreds and hundreds of other plants. So it's all interconnected. And I'm curious, this is a question that comes up for a lot of people, especially people who've been on this path for a really long time. And they, there's this kind of air of like, oh, we should leave these plants alone. And, people need to stop doing this. And, then we get in, Tim Ferriss wrote about this last year, stop working with toad medicine because it's being over harvested. Everything's running into the same problem.
Yeah.
People who are combo facilitators with the frog swear, oh no, but this particular combo is definitely came from a sustainable practice where they don't hurt the frogs. I mean, I've heard that 1,000 times. But what are your views, or even Chacruna's views, if you can speak for them, but what are your views on this balance of, getting, like you said, like getting the healing, right? People are here for the healing or for, treating all the societal problems that we have. There's trauma, there's mental illness. We could go on and on. But, there is this desire for healing and growth and coming back and finding that connectedness. And then there's kind of the people that are just like, okay, more. It's the same problem that caused all the problems in the first place. But how do we bring this into balance? And what are your views on, the rising popularity of all these medicines? Like, is this a good thing? Is this going to be like another thing that we all self-destruct? Or, what are your views on that?
Yeah, now I'm remembering your question about sustainable harvesting. I think... And I'm glad you mentioned like synthetic psychedelics or second generation psychedelics, because I think people try to divorce that from the conversation somehow by, it's like, I don't need to worry about it because I'm not working with the plants. Unfortunately, or fortunately, everything is sourced from nature, no matter what it is, even if it's synthetic. And so the destruction of biodiversity is going to affect those sources as well. And psychedelic science and psychedelic medicine, as we know it, is directly connected to indigenous use of psychedelic plants because, Humphrey Osmond and Abram Hoffer and the people that coined the term psychedelic were sitting with the Native American church in teepees and going through, medicine ceremonies. And so it's kind of impossible to separate. There's a direct continuity there, and that's definitely something that I can speak for Chacruna in saying. As far as like Chacruna's opinion on the good versus bad of this rising popularity, I think that's kind of Chacruna's trying to be compassionate and well-informed space for gathering writing from experts in the field, from indigenous people, from marginalized people, and bring it all into the conversation. And I don't know if I can say Chacruna's stance, but for myself and for Erie, it's important to like recognize the confirmation bias and like the idea like, oh, well, actually, it's not so bad. There's actually lots of, it's actually sustainable. So that over harvesting stuff is just like doom mongering or something. I know that's not what you're saying, and probably that's an exaggeration of what people's perspectives are, but I think that gives me like a clue that maybe there's something more to the story. And I think if you look at, I mean, just from working with indigenous communities, it's really impossible to ignore the fact that the poverty levels are still abysmal, even alongside these successful ventures and the rising popularity of this field. And I think I love that people are coming up with sustainable ways to grow, to source ayahuasca vines, or whether that's like growing from clones in Hawaii or like having your own gardens and sources of different things. I think those are, at the moment, those are very small drops in a large ocean, which is mostly a story of unsustainable over harvesting. Like you said, ayahuasca vines grow very, very far up tall canopy trees, and indigenous people traditionally, a lot of the harvesting practice was like dangerous climbing up a tree, cutting a very specific section. Now people just cut a whole tree down, take the whole vine from root to tip, ship it into the tourist centers. Whoever paid them to do that is not obviously living in that community. But then again, there are communities who are selling their ayahuasca because it's so valuable, because they're trying to survive and they're under increasing pressure, and like not, you know, Erie isn't interested in propagating this myth about indigenous people as like perfect conservationists versus you know, whatever other stereotype. They're not, they're all like, the other part besides relationship involved in Erie is autonomy or agency, and that is like the most important thing that we can contribute to for indigenous communities and local people. Then they'll make their own decisions, but they'll be in a more empowered position so they can decide what kind of relationships they want to have with the extractive industries. And unfortunately, they still have to work with them. And in the modern context, that's like everything is about their relationships with these outside authorities, whether that's like conservation, you know, biosphere reserve authorities, national park authorities, government authorities, or businesses that are trying to source cheap labor or cheap resources. And they're all, it's just like the fabric of the economy. There's not really like much nuance to it. It's just like, unfortunately, that's just the reality. And I think it would be a little naive to try to frame it in some sort of positive way that it tries to indicate that like it's really not so bad. I think from what I've seen, there's just a lot of people experiencing the effects of this very, very extreme growth in this like ayahuasca tourism, in this plant medicine tourism. It's really hard to overstate how much it's grown in just the past decade, especially in the past few years. And that has a huge effect. If it was something else, I mean, in the past, it's been other things. It's been herbal medicines or rubber or every story of from colonialism. It's the same thing happening now. It's just in a slightly more, even sometimes worse, because we have better technology and the extraction can happen at a more extreme rate. But I think it's tricky because like a lot of people are finding ways to get income from this industry as well. So it's not all negative, but it's just, even those positive things are usually restricted to like a very small family or shaman or a specific group that has that notoriety or that recognition from the psychedelic community. So there's only a handful of indigenous people names that most psychedelic enthusiasts probably can name, and it's because they are known for using those psychedelic plants, and then everyone else is left out. And Erie includes both. So we have groups that nobody has heard of in the psychedelic space, or not very many, and they might not be as associated with psychedelic plants. And then we have groups that are very closely tied. So we work with Ashaninka and Shipibo communities, as well as, you know, Huichol and Mazatec and many, many others who might not be known in the space, and so they just won't get that special treatment. So that's another reason why Erie is a pool of funds that's evenly distributed to all 20 organizations, and it's not trying to create this competitive atmosphere of people vying for attention and recognition. But primarily it's about giving these communities the most autonomy and agency that we can, and reducing the pressures on them, so then they can decide how to move forward with their approach to conservation, with their approach to sustainable harvesting. And that's really the key. So it's like, if they decide to harvest in a way that you might think is unsustainable, it's because they had some priority of survival that needed to be met. But it's if a business from the outside or somebody who runs a retreat center does it, their decisions are based on a different set of incentives, and more likely it's going to be, I think, in a negative direction, just because that's, I mean, like we said, it's about the incentives that the system creates, and it's really hard to get around those as much as you might have the good intentions. But yeah, and a lot of the issues around peyote, for example, they come from land use and like the destruction of habitat for, creating a new development, whether that's like a strip mall or a business or a residential area or whatever. And it's not necessarily people over harvesting peyote, although that happens too, and there's poaching, and there's all that's always an issue. But it's like the destruction of the habitat is happening at such a huge rate, on a huge scale. And this also goes for in the Amazon, where other plant medicines come from, in all forests. And you can do a nursery and a reforestation project, but that deforestation is still happening so much that you really have to address that if you want to do anything. And I think Erie tries to focus more on that than specific plant medicine, like sourcing.
This is great. It's really helpful to know. I have so many questions about like, well, I've heard this and I've heard that. It's interesting. I've gotten the feedback from people that they believe like all this medicine should just be free. That's one I've heard a lot in this just over the years, like, well, it comes from the earth and it should just be free for everybody.
Yeah.
I'm curious what you think of that.
I think all medicine should be free.
All medicine.
I don't think medicine should be a profit-driven industry, but I think cost comes in different forms, and all things have a cost, and that's different than the cost paying for something with money, and that is the cost that we're all alienated from by being disconnected from the source of our food and medicine and from ourselves and our communities. And so that's what INE and reciprocity is addressing, is the fact that everything costs something. It costs energy, it costs time, it costs some exertion by somebody else gave you what you're eating, what you're healing yourself with, and that cost is hidden and separated from you as much as possible, so that you're not aware of it, so that you don't understand the system that you're in and the relationships that you are living by. And I think that's what's really important to understand. And if cost is conflated with like monetary price, then I would agree that medicine should be free. But I have to also say nothing is free. And I would like to see, like, I think it's wonderful that people are more aware, having more access, having better information about psychedelics and psychedelic plants and medicines, and they're being applied in so many amazing ways. There is like a cynical part of me that sees it as the Brave New World. This is like the way that people are going to be able to get through increased levels of exploitation and alienation, is by having these medicines that allow you to like not just give up. Treating PTSD, for example. I'm sure that there are some people that see that as like the solution to sustaining forever wars and having, not really solving by like not starting wars and not be starting armed conflicts and instead we can just have a very, very effective way to treat the symptoms of that, and it'll just keep going, and it'll be endorsed by the state, because it's like, hey, look, we're going to let you play around with these things, and they're going to help you in your psychological healing and your ability to cope with the dystopia that we've created. And so it's like, that's obviously I'm not like thrilled about that possibility.
No, I actually brought that up with Charles Eisenstein. I said, well, we can treat all this depression, PTSD, and anxiety, but what about the root of all the depression, PTSD, and anxiety, which is actually the bigger problem? And it comes back to all the systems being completely broken.
Yeah.
In the end, it's like even the whole cost, like on some level, excuse me, when people say to me, ayahuasca should just be free, or mushrooms should be free, or all of this, but then I'm like, well, let's see. The person I work with is based in the middle of nowhere in Peru, and he has a team of people who help him make the medicine. The medicine is, if you've never seen medicine being made, it takes a lot of labor. There's a lot of human labor involved. They pound it all by hand, and then they cook it down, and then they have to eventually bring it onto a plane and come to America and serve it to, I'm like, well, none of that is free in our real 3D world that we live in right now. And the workers, like you said, it's like, I've been to these communities, and I'm like, Indigenous people are the places I've been. I'm sure maybe you've been to different places, but they're not necessarily like living off the land. They still have, things to buy, and there's still houses, and there's still gasoline. And as someone put it, as I donated to someone's Sundance a few years ago, they said, look, tobacco doesn't put gas in their tanks.
Yeah.
And we would all love to donate the tobacco that I grew in my garden, but that's like, there's a real, there's a reality to the world we live in. And I don't agree with majority of the reality, but then it's like, well, we have to work within this reality right now to create the new reality, which hopefully we'll see in our lifetime.
It's never ending. The work is something we have to engage with all the time. And it's the sort of like romantic idea that people have about living off the land. When it's applied to Indigenous communities, it's important to also remember that their land availability has shrunk so much that, the community that I spent time with during graduate school, the Yanesha, they used to have like 700 cultivars of the manioc or cassava root, which they call yucca, and now they have like 4, and they don't even have the Indigenous names for them anymore. They're just they just know the Spanish names, and maybe like 1 or 2 people know the old names. And maintaining all these different idiosyncratic little varieties of something requires a lot of time and land availability. And now they have to use whatever land they have left for growing things, to grow coffee. That's the best cash crop. That's what keeps people going. And then even that's not enough. They have to sell their labor to other landowners and work for a wage. And that's most Indigenous communities up until the past few decades have been, living by wage labor. Now there's a new field of cultural tourism. And so they can sell that as another way of creating an income. And sometimes that isn't always, it doesn't mean it's a cynical thing. It's like they really are revitalizing their culture and creating incentives for the youth to learn about their culture and stay in the community instead of leave to go to the city or whatever, because there's a way of getting income by embracing your cultural identity rather than trying to get away from it because of discrimination and all the other good reasons why people have, left behind a lot of their cultural identity. Now there are possibilities and ways of living that allow that to not happen in the same degree, but it's just subject to all the same inequalities and imbalances that come with any industry in this global capitalist economy. And so it's like living off the land. If those people who are laboring to harvest and prepare and process the plants that will eventually end up at a retreat center, I'm sure that they're not really seeing an equitable like distribution of the profits that are made, because they do charge a lot at those centers, and it's probably, a lot of them are probably better than other industries that pay cents to their laborers for whatever they're producing in the U.S. or importing into the U.S. And I think I would love to see that keep happening, that gap shrink, and like the people at the very lowest level, the ground level, who are supporting all of it, getting a bigger share. I think for some people they see like, well, I need this cheap labor, so if you give them too big of a share, then they won't need to sell their labor that same way anymore, and now my business model is broken. So yeah, I think it's but to get back to the question about money, like people say that this medicine should be free, healing should be free. I agree. But when it comes to paying and having access to medical care, but then that requires that everyone is being equitably compensated at every level, and that comes hand in hand with the medicine being free. And so if those two things happened, perfect, we can have free medicine for everyone, and free food and shelter and all the things that we need. That requires a huge systemic change, and I think it's something that I'm not sure how to approach. That's more of a political question, and like I think Erie is restricted and limited by the way it operates within the nonprofit space. It relies on philanthropy and just individual people being generous, and that's not the way that it needs to happen, but that's the way that I could imagine an immediate way to do something good that is impactful, that is based around principles and a model and design that will hopefully strengthen over time and create something that's organic and can continue. And eventually, when those other things change, hopefully, you won't need Erie anymore. We won't need nonprofits. But yeah, it's a big question.
Yeah, it's like we got to start somewhere. You know. Well, one more minute. So just one last question. If there's one thing that, let's say, listeners want to do, because there is that sense of like, what can I do? How can I contribute? You know, what change can I make within myself to maybe do my little part to affect the bigger change that we all want to see? You know, what's one thing you would suggest, or a couple of things, if you can think of any?
I mean, I would suggest joining Chacruna's newsletter and staying in tune with everything Chacruna does. I think if you're looking for a place to donate, I think Chacruna and for me, the Indigenous Reciprocity Initiative, if depending on what you want that donation to go towards, I think it's a unique way to just create like a unified pathway to try to address this like fundamental issue and address, you know, conservation of biodiversity, of plant medicines, of indigenous communities, and also trying to heal that separation and alienation, which kind of is at the root of a lot of these things we've been talking about. I think in like your personal life, I mean, you asked about like going, like encouraging or discouraging people from using plant medicines or traveling to indigenous areas and communities. And I don't want to discourage people from doing that, but I do think that it's not necessary. there are ways to connect with the place where you are, with the land that you're on. There's an indigenous name for it. There are communities, indigenous people, where you are. There is an environment and a habitat there that you can connect with and you can learn about. And you can learn about the different communities of plants and animals and other organisms that live around you. And you can start to connect with those ecological relationships. And of course, like, healing the relationship that you have with yourself and with your immediate community, I think is like the most important thing. And that happens through daily practice. It's not like a decision that you make. And, you know, it can involve the plants on your windowsill or on the street outside of your house, or wherever. And just getting involved with those local movements and local conservation initiatives and local food security, biodiversity. There's something going on around you, and if there's not, then you should start it. But, you know, I think everybody has limited time. Everyone is trying to survive. And so, you know, in some sense, just surviving and taking care of yourself, for some people, that's the most they can do. But if you have a little spare income and you want to donate to something, I think that Erie is a good place to start.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Joseph. It was such an honor to talk to you and hear about all this. And we will have the links to Erie and Chacruna and all these resources you mentioned here in this interview right here in the show notes. Thank you so much for being with us. I really appreciate your time and especially the work that you're doing at Chacruna with you and everybody there in that amazing organization. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beth. It was a pleasure to talk to you and to be able to share about all these things that are close to my heart and yours as well, I know. So thank you.
Very much. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you're feeling inspired, I'd appreciate it if you showed your love with a review. And check out my YouTube channel where you can find the video version of this podcast. You can also head to bethaweinstein.com to learn more about me and grab my free business growth trainings. Remember, you carry your own unique medicine, and your medicine is what we need for these times.